The Roman Empire wasn't just built on military conquest and political intrigue. It was sustained by an insatiable appetite for luxury goods that flowed into the empire from the far corners of the known world. To truly understand Rome, we need to understand this obsession with imported luxuries, because it reveals something profound about Roman society, economics, and ultimately the vulnerabilities that would contribute to the empire's transformation. This wasn't just about wealthy people buying nice things. This was a civilization-wide addiction that shaped trade routes, influenced foreign policy, and drained the empire's precious metal reserves for centuries. Let's start by understanding what Romans were actually buying. Silk from China was perhaps the most coveted luxury item in the Roman world. Roman women of high status would pay astronomical prices for silk garments, and the demand was so intense that silk became almost synonymous with decadence and luxury. The problem was that Romans had no idea how silk was made. They believed it grew on trees or was combed from leaves. This ignorance meant they were completely dependent on middlemen, particularly the Parthians and later the Sassanids, who controlled the trade routes and marked up prices dramatically. A single pound of silk could cost the equivalent of a Roman soldier's annual salary, yet demand never seemed to diminish. Spices from India and Arabia were equally prized. Black pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, and frankincense weren't just cooking ingredients or religious offerings. They were status symbols. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, complained bitterly about Rome's spice addiction, noting that the empire was sending enormous quantities of gold and silver eastward every year just to satisfy Romans' desire for pepper, to season their food in incense to burn at funerals. He calculated that India, Arabia, and China were draining at least 100 million sesterces from the Roman economy annually, an absolutely staggering sum. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to pay nearly 20,000 soldiers for a year. The economics of this luxury trade were fascinating and ultimately unsustainable. Rome had a fundamental trade imbalance with the East. The empire produced relatively few goods that Eastern markets wanted. Romans could offer wine, olive oil, glassware, and some metalwork, but these items didn't command the prices that Eastern luxuries did in Roman markets. The result was that Rome was constantly exporting precious metals, gold and silver coins, to pay for imports. Archaeologists have found hoards of Roman coins throughout India, evidence of this one-way flow of wealth. The Roman monetary system was essentially hemorrhaging precious metals to satisfy luxury consumption. This trade imbalance troubled Roman moralists and economists, though they couldn't seem to stop it. Writers like Pliny, Seneca, and Tacitus regularly condemned the luxury trade, calling it effeminate, corrupting, and economically ruinous. They understood that Rome was impoverishing itself for frivolous pleasures. Seneca wrote scathingly about Roman women wearing clothing so sheer it revealed more than it concealed, about men perfuming themselves like women, about the absurdity of paying fortunes for cups made from a single gemstone. But these moral critiques had virtually no impact on actual behavior. The luxury market continued to grow. Why were Romans so obsessed with these imports? Part of the answer lies in Roman social structure and the importance of status display. Roman society was intensely hierarchical and competitive, particularly among the elite. Wealthy Romans were constantly trying to outdo each other in displays of wealth and sophistication. Hosting lavish dinner parties became a competitive sport, and serving exotic foods seasoned with rare spices, using tableware made from precious materials, and having guests recline on silk cushions were all ways to demonstrate superior status. The satirist Petronius brilliantly captured this competitive consumption in his Satyricon, where the nouveau riche character Trimalchio serves increasingly absurd and expensive dishes to impress his guests. But luxury consumption wasn't limited to the super rich. One of the remarkable features of Roman luxury trade was how far down the social ladder it reached. Even relatively modest households wanted a little bit of pepper, a small amount of incense, perhaps a glass vessel from Alexandria. This broad-based demand is what made the luxury trade so economically significant. It wasn't just a handful of millionaires buying exotic goods. It was hundreds of thousands of people throughout the empire, each making small purchases that collectively added up to an enormous drain on resources. The routes these luxury goods traveled were themselves remarkable achievements of ancient globalization. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, but a network of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. Caravans would travel for months through Central Asia, facing bandits, harsh weather, and difficult terrain. Maritime routes were equally important. Indian merchants would sail across the Indian Ocean, taking advantage of monsoon winds that Roman sailors had learned to predict by the 1st century. Ships would leave Egyptian ports on the Red Sea, sail down the East African coast or directly across to India, load up with spices, gems, and other goods, and return months later. These voyages were dangerous, but the profit margins were so enormous that merchants were willing to risk everything. The Roman government was deeply involved in facilitating this trade because it was such a significant source of tax revenue. The empire maintained roads, protected sea lanes from pirates, and established customs stations where import duties were collected. A luxury item might be taxed multiple times as it crossed provincial boundaries within the empire. These taxes helped fund the imperial government, creating a perverse incentive. Even though the trade was draining precious metals from the empire, it was generating tax revenue in the short term, so there was little political will to restrict it. Some Romans did try to limit luxury consumption through sumptuary laws. These laws, passed periodically throughout Roman history, attempted to regulate who could wear certain colors, how much could be spent on banquets, what kind of transportation people could use, and so on. The problem was that these laws were almost impossible to enforce and widely ignored. Wealthy Romans would pay the fines and continue their luxurious lifestyles. The laws became something of a joke, a way for politicians to appear concerned about moral decline without actually changing anything. The addiction to luxury imports had genuine economic consequences for the Roman Empire. The constant outflow of precious metals contributed to currency debasement. As gold and silver became scarcer within the empire, emperors began reducing the precious metal content in coins, leading to inflation. By the 3rd century, this process had accelerated dramatically, contributing to an economic crisis that nearly destroyed the empire. While luxury imports weren't the only cause of Rome's monetary problems, they were a significant factor that had been building for centuries. There's also a fascinating psychological dimension to Roman luxury consumption that feels remarkably modern. Romans were aware they were being irrational. They knew they were paying absurd prices for items that weren't necessities. They read the moralizing texts condemning luxury. Yet they couldn't stop themselves. This is the nature of addiction, whether to substances or to status consumption. The temporary pleasure and social validation gained from luxury purchases outweighed the long-term rational analysis of their economic impact. The luxury trade also created dependencies that had geopolitical implications. Rome needed stable relations with Parthia and later Sassanid Persia because these empires controlled the land routes for silk and other goods. When relations deteriorated and trade was disrupted, it caused genuine distress in Roman markets. Similarly, Rome's interest in maintaining control over Egypt was partly motivated by Egypt's position as the gateway to Red Sea trade routes. The economics of luxury shaped military and diplomatic priorities in ways that are easy to overlook, but were quite significant. Interestingly, Rome's luxury addiction also stimulated technological innovation and exploration. The desire to cut out middlemen and access luxury goods more directly motivated Roman exploration of new sea routes. The famous Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century merchant's guide to Indian Ocean trade, reflects Roman efforts to understand and exploit these routes more effectively. Roman glassmaking technology advanced partly because artisans were trying to imitate expensive imported vessels. The luxury trade created knowledge exchange as well as goods exchange. By the late empire, luxury consumption patterns were changing but not disappearing. As the empire fragmented and the economy became more localized, long-distance luxury trade declined, but regional luxury goods filled the gap. The fundamental Roman desire for status through consumption remained constant. This continuity suggests that the luxury addiction wasn't just about the specific items Romans imported, but about something deeper in Roman culture, a need to display status through material goods that transcended any particular historical circumstances.